Hey friends, this is part 3 of our Women in the Book of Acts series. Today we're talking about Mary, mother of John Mark and Rhoda. This, if you want to read along, is in chapter 12 in the book of Acts. And I'm just going to summarize verses 12, 6 through 11, and then we'll read 6 through 17, we'll say. Basically, Peter is put into prison. He does something that some people don't like, and then he ends up in prison. An angel comes and breaks him out of prison, though. So, then the story picks up on verse 12. As soon as Peter realized all of this, basically realized that he had been set free from prison, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many had gathered and were praying. When he knocked on the outer gate, a maid named Rhoda came to answer. On recognizing Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed that instead of opening the gate, she ran in and announced that Peter was standing at the gate. They said to her, "You are out of your mind." But Rhoda insisted that it was so. They said, "It is his angel," basically implying that he had died then. Meanwhile, Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the gate, they saw him and were amazed. Peter motioned to them with his hand to be silent and described for them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he added, "Tell this to James and the other believers." Then he left and went to another place. A few things are happening here. One, all of these followers of the way, all of these early Christians are gathered at this woman's house, Mary, the mother of John Mark. Now, in last week's video, I talked about how people have multiple names because of different cultures that they're interacting with. This is something that's common today. You'll often hear of folks that immigrate to the United States. Maybe they have a name that they're using in their own immigrant group, and then they have a name that's more outward-facing or more assimilized into American culture. This is what's happening here with Mary, which is kind of a standard name that you see that in a few different cultures of the time, and John Mark, who was just another disciple. Not John from the Gospel of John, not John the Baptist, not Mark who wrote the Gospel of Mark. This is probably another disciple. But there were a lot of people who had similar names back then. After all, even in the disciples, there were 2 disciples named Judas. So what's happening here is that all of the early Christians are meeting at this woman's house, at Mary's house, mother of John Mark, different than Mary that we highlighted, the Mary, the mother of Jesus. And Rhoda, it says that she's a maid. If you look actually in the Greek, it's slave girl is a more accurate translation. Pretty much anytime you see servant in the Bible, you can substitute slave in there, and that'll fit. And so Peter appears to Rhoda, this enslaved woman, and only appears to her. He can hear her voice, or she can hear his voice, but no one else can. This is actually not that different from the story of Jesus' resurrection, where Jesus appears to the women, but not to the male disciples. He appears to the women first, just like Peter is appearing first to Rhoda, the woman who's the lowest status, the person who's enslaved in this group. And of course, they don't believe her, and then they're saying, well, it's more likely that Peter died and that you were talking to his ghost than that what you're saying is actually true, that he was somehow able to escape from prison. It's important to note as we're reading that this is actually supposed to be kind of a funny story. We have a few different things happening here. We have Peter who escapes out of this Roman prison guarded by all of these professional soldiers, but he can't get through a gate. He's stuck outside the gate waiting because Rhoda, this woman, this enslaved woman, hears his voice and then runs off to tell everybody else. The funny thing about that is that he could escape from this prison, but obviously can't get through this house gate. The other funny thing is that nobody believes Rhoda because she's of low status. She's a woman, and also that on top of that, she is enslaved. And yet, she is the one that St. Peter appears to first. This is something that we see throughout the book of Luke and throughout the book of Acts, that God is working through people that may be considered low status or less valuable, but God has value for them. God has value for Rhoda, and God has value for Mary, and God cares for both of them in this story. Even if the common society around them might not have those same values, God is trying to show a different way to exist in the world. What a beautiful lesson for us today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. Otherwise, I hope that you enjoyed today's story. This is part 3 on a 6-part series about women in the book of Acts with Mary and Rhoda.